making our own histogram is one way that we could try to figure out how to do this. Now, I'm not going to show you all a photo and say, okay, let's build a histogram from this, because that'd be terrible. We'd have to take every pixel, calculate the luminance at every pixel, and then build the histogram from there. But I still am kind of mean, so let's try to figure out what the histogram of this would be. And so if we're just talking about this conceptually, and rather than each of you pulling out a piece of paper, because we're not that elementary school here. So if we have this image in Photoshop and we wanted to know what that histogram would look like, how would we do this? Well, first let's think about it this way. Which spikes would be the tallest? Yep, so these primary colors, red, the green, and the blue. How much taller would they be? Yeah, so they'd be twice as tall. So we have some spikes. We have 4 spikes somewhere for these colors. They're a certain height. And then we have twice as tall these other spikes for this color information. And so, because remember these histograms are a fixed height, we can imagine that these tall spikes are going to take up the entirety of the histogram. Then those half spikes will be exactly half of it there. So we have a couple of easy ones that we could try to knock off on our histogram. And just temporarily I'll try to, I know this will be tough to see, but I'll show you more concretely. This is just so we can write it down on the blackboard for now. So let's just try to get some of the easy ones out of the way. So what are some easy ones we can do right now? The white and the black. Okay, so we know that those are half height. And the black one will be all the way back here. The white one will be all the way up here. So I'm drawing multiple lines, but I'm just trying to give it thickness rather than trying to imply that it's wider. Okay, so what other ones would be easy? Yep, okay, so the red, the green, and the blue. So let's do it in the reverse order. Blue, which would be, yep, so about 10% over here, and it'd be the entire height. How about green? Yep, 60% over, so not all the way to the right, but almost. So about there. And then we have red, which is 30%, so it's about there, something like that. Okay, now we have these 2 other colors, which are a little bit more complicated, a yellow and a cyan. And I sort of gave these answers away earlier when I was talking about combining these, so I hope you were paying attention. So how can we make these 2 last spikes on this histogram? So the yellow would be what? Would be halfway between the red. So why is that? Why would it be? So it's actually not quite. So if we keep in mind that yellow is made up of which 2 colors? It's made up of the red and the green, which means that if we have a yellow color, then we have the complete presence of that particular color, which means that we have 255 times 0.6 plus 255 times 0.3, and I'm just rounding here to make it easier. So that means we have 255 times 0.9. So this is going to be about 90% of the way over. Okay, so we have another half spike that's about here. So this yellow one is brighter. It's brighter to us, but it is also brighter in the luminance calculation than any of these primary colors. That's what this should be telling you. Okay, so how about this cyan one? Which one is that? Yeah, blue and green. So we have 0.6 plus 0.1, so we get about 70% of the way over. So we have a little spike that's just a little bit to the right of our green one. Okay. That wasn't too painful, right? And in fact, it would have been a lot easier had we just put it into Photoshop in the first place. And you see that we get exactly the same thing that we just talked about. Pretty neat, I think. Okay. Now, yes, this is breaking it down a little bit much, but the whole point of this is to get you to understand what this is showing you. And secondly, that there is more than just luminosity. So if you remember, when I was over here in Photoshop somewhere, And at first it wasn't showing me the correct histogram. That's because there's a variety of histograms available to me. So the other ones aren't quite as difficult to figure out as luminosity. So we've gotten the hard one out of the way, but it's important to show the difference between it. Now, before we even get into that, imagine that we're talking about things that are just a little bit more photographic. So rather than having just these very big swaths of color that are, completely colorful and completely saturated, we have something that's a little bit more photographic, and this is a gradient. So you can imagine that if we have a red gradient from red all the way to white, it starts out red and it's getting brighter and brighter and brighter. And so that's the sort of histogram that we see here. Now here's a question for you. Why is it so jagged? Why does it go up and down, rather than looking sort of like a smooth amount? So first of all, I guess even before that, why does it go down and then come back up in this gradient?
Because there's more extremes on either end.
Right, that's right. So over here, there's a certain amount of width of pixels of pure red and pure white, and those are sort of the high points in this parabola of sorts. So if this gradient was more uniform, so if there was less of the pure red on this end and less of the pure white on this end, then it would be a bit flatter. But that's not the case. There's more red and more white than the gradient itself. So we see this sort of dip in the middle. Now we have this kind of crazy up and down motion. Why might that be? Any ideas? Okay, well, it is because and you can imagine that this is a gradient, but as it's being transformed, as it's increasing the amount of white, so as it's getting more and more white, there's more of some pixels than other. It can't be perfectly even unless it were exactly the width of let's see, it would have to be something like 65,000 pixels wide or something like that, and it would have to be exactly one value separated between each before you would get a very, very nice curved histogram. It's just the difference in the amount of values that you see. And in fact, Photoshop does a pretty bad job of smoothing out those histograms for us, and we see these sort of jagged histograms in Photoshop a lot more than we would in, say, our cameras, which try to smoothen them out a little bit to make it a little bit more legible, versus this, which I think is going for accuracy. Okay, now you can imagine that, I did mention that we have several different types of histograms, more than just luminosity. So hopefully this histogram makes sense to you. But what if we had a histogram that was just showing us the red color, only red? What would that look like? So it's a trick question.
It would be more sort of centered on this, or on the 30% left hand.
Okay, so let me break this down a little bit more. Remember that a histogram goes from 0, the value of 0, all the way to 255. So if we had a histogram measuring red, then we're measuring the frequency of red pixels that are 0 to 255. So what could it look like? This is going to blow your mind. There's no angles, it is just a line. And the reason for that is that this is completely red throughout here. Remember, what makes white? We're adding more and more green and blue, which means that this has to be completely red on this end as much as this side is red as well. So over here on this end, we have not only the complete presence of green, the complete presence of blue, but also the complete presence of red. So even though this side isn't red, red still has to be here in terms of its values for it to look like this. Okay, so how about green then? Right, so here there's a complete absence of green, and then it goes to the complete presence of green. So we would expect it to be sort of a line. And remember that since we have this sort of buffer on either end where there's a little bit more red and a little bit more white on each end, we have this sort of curved down appearance. And so blue is actually a similar thing. So these histograms are very, very different, but they tell us some pretty important things, or some very interesting things at least, about this particular image. Yes? So I'm not quite sure I understand the question. You're not sure why there's so much green on either end?
Yeah, if the green and blue luminancy histograms are applied to that red gradient.
Up here? At the luminance histogram? Oh.
So the red gradient.
Yes.
And the green and blue are also measuring the amount of green and blue in that red gradient.
Right.
I don't understand how there's a lot of green and blue value on the left.
Okay, so the color in this histogram is misleading. So keep in mind that at this far end, this means that there's a value of 0, which means that there's no green. So when this is giving you a bar right here, this means that there are this many pixels that have the value of green is 0, where the value of green is 0. So over here, there's so many pixels. There's a little rectangle of pure red pixels that have 0 green values associated to them, and that is what this is measuring right here. So what would be more accurate, perhaps, is if this itself were a gradient where it had the same shape, but the color of this shape goes from black to green. That might make a little bit more sense, but but it only makes sense at first, only because once we know that that is how this is measuring those values, then it can become a little bit hairier if we have a differently shaped histogram. So it's better if we have a uniform color, at least for this particular histogram. Okay. Oh, yes.
Following on that, if on the left side, of course, not the far left, but maybe 10% over, there's some green value, some blue value. How come there's no blue?
Oh, so here, so in this left portion, there's some red, there's some green, and there's some blue, but there's no luminance. So remember, the luminance is showing us the apparent brightness of the image. And that is what that luminance calculation was all about. So there can be some values where there are no green pixels and no blue pixels, but because there are red pixels here everywhere throughout the image, this entire image has a certain amount of brightness to our eyes. And that is what the luminance is showing us. So if this was a black to white gradient, then the luminance would extend all the way, and so would each of these color values, just because in that case, at the black end, there's a complete absence of all of these colors, and at the right end, there's a complete presence of all of these colors. Now, it's conceptually difficult, and that is what this slide is trying to show us, is the difference between the luminance histogram and these other histograms that exist, is that there can be pixels where there's no blue and no green, and we can have this sort of unintuitive gap in the luminance histogram. It's just important to realize that the luminance is only showing us the apparent brightness. That's all the difference is. It's not some summation of the other values that exist in the red, in the green, and the blue. It's actually showing us the apparent brightness of that image. And so this can actually be detrimental, as we'll see in the second half, when we are trying to use the histogram to try to figure out if we've not only overexposed something, but more importantly, if we've just overexposed one particular color channel. So with that, let's take a 5-minute break, and when we come back, we'll talk more about the fascinating world of histograms. Okay, welcome back, everybody. So before we dive right back into histograms, just wanted to give out a quick reminder that the third assignment is coming out. It seems crazy that we're already halfway through the semester in terms of assignments. And it just seems like 3 weeks ago when it was still light outside at this point in time today. So it's a little depressing. But despite the fact that we have less daylight, you should hopefully still be able to get some truly excellent photos for this assignment. So as with assignment 2, there are 3 parts to this assignment. The first is just a theoretical problem set-like part. Second part is primarily taking photos type part. And one thing that I do want to mention, so there's a few changes from the second assignment. Some of the types of photos that you'll be taking is slightly different, but also you'll notice that the technical requirements, though, while largely the same in terms of keeping your photos unmodified and making sure that you submit them in JPEG formats and you don't modify them, said that twice, so on and so forth, just making sure that it's really understood. I do mention that you can start taking photos in the RAW format. And the reason for this is that you will probably want to start building your library of RAW photographs, because that way you might be able to start using them maybe for your final project. You could potentially use them for some of the questions that are coming in the 4th assignment. But it's still important that you realize that even if you do take photos in the RAW format, you don't have to, first of all. You can continue taking photos in the JPEG, and in fact, you must submit them to Flickr in the JPEG format. And the reason for that is that Flickr only takes JPEG photos. So if you do decide to take photos in the RAW format on your camera, I recommend the setting. Some cameras have a RAW plus JPEG option where it will take the same photograph and save it in both formats at the same time. Then that way you can just sort of file away the RAW format file, and you can upload the JPEG to Flickr. If you do decide to take photos in RAW and your camera only supports the RAW format, you'll need to process them into JPEG formats. You can either use the software that came with your camera or Photoshop. Just keep in mind to use the default options when you process it and submit it. You don't want to do too much of changing of that photo in software. Then, of course, the third part of the assignment is it's the similar thing as with last time, where if you're having a problem with one of the images, upload it to Flickr, and everyone else in this room will help you with that. And of course, I don't want you to feel like we're trying to force you to use the Flickr discussion board. That's not what this is about at all. What it's about is getting feedback on your photos and thinking critically about other people's photos. So this is one of the relatively few aspects, as you can tell from this lecture. It's somewhat technical, this material. And this is one of the few ways that we get to discuss each other's photos, maybe step outside of that technical aspect a little bit and talk a little bit about the artistic side of it. And in fact, if you read the somewhat appropriate cartoon on the front, it's very much similar to that, where it's from this web comic that, especially initially, was really quite funny, called What the Duck, and it involves photography and ducks and what's not to like about that. So anyway, back to this. Of course, if you do have any questions, you can feel free to let any of us know. Now, I know that talking about some of this stuff is a little bit confusing, and you may be wondering why on earth we're talking about this in the first place. And don't worry, as always, it will come together a little bit later. Rest assured that I'm not just teaching you this to wow you with technical knowledge or anything like that. There is very real purpose to this. And I also know that understanding the difference between the luminance histogram and these other ones can be a little bit complicated. So let's just try a quick mental exercise. Yes? No question.
I'm not just trying to track this. So if there was no green or blue,
Yes.
would that entire box be red? If there was no green or blue in this area?
If there was no green or blue, would the entire box, in which portion?
The photo, the big box over here, would this all be red?
Would this all be red if there were no green and if there was no green and no blue in the picture? Yes, that's correct. And in fact, you see that here, what we're doing with this, these 3 histograms is we're breaking it down into what are called channels. So we have a red channel, we have a green channel, and we have a blue channel. And we can actually open this sort of thing up in Photoshop. It's usually associated with layers. It's the tab right next to that. And you can usually select one of these channels and see only that channel, and they convert that channel to black to white. That's not a luminance conversion. They're just showing you the black values are, the complete absence of that color. So if we're looking at the blue channel, for example, we can imagine that the blue channel would look like black to white, because there's a complete absence of blue on this side, there's the complete presence of blue on this side, and it's this gradient as we go from left to right. And we'll be talking about channels when we're probably in the next lecture when we go into more software tools. But as a mental exercise, let's think about what would happen if we changed this gradient a little bit. So rather than a gradient of red to white, how would each of these histograms, and first let's talk about the luminance histogram, how would each of these histograms change if it was a red to black? So it's the same thing, except instead of being white, it's a gradient of red all the way to black. So the luminance histogram is talking about the brightness, the apparent brightness of the image. So how would that look? Yeah, so it's basically the inverse of this. It starts at the very far left, and I can't quite reach it, and it goes about 30% of the way over. Now, how about the red channel? Be careful here. What will this look like? It doesn't look the same because if we go from red to black, remember, what is black? It's this total absence of a color. So it's also not on the far left side because there is some red in this photo. So it's basically, it looks like this green one, but it's in this red because we go from the complete presence and then through this gradient and then to the, or rather this complete presence, we go through the red values and then to the complete absence of red. And so what about the green channel? Well, there's no green at all because we're just going from red to black. We're not adding any extra colors. So we have a green channel histogram that's just one spike at the very far left. Blue channel is the same sort of thing. And in fact, during the break, I quickly made up that exact image. So we have here a histogram that goes from red all the way to black. And we have here the Photoshop window that shows us the histogram. So you can see this is the luminosity histogram that we determined. We can look at the red channel only, and it goes from completely black to completely red. Green channel, complete absence of it. Blue channel, complete absence of it. Now you'll notice that there's a couple other histograms that exist here as well. And so talking about these red, green, and blue channels is really meant to be sort of cursory because we do have these other, perhaps more important histograms that exist as well. So I would argue that these three are perhaps the three that you should really sort of know. You might use those red, those green, and the blue ones, but it's going to be pretty rare. And in fact, the majority of the time you'll be using the luminance histogram and possibly the RGB. Now, sometimes your camera will allow you to choose other histograms, and that really is up to your camera. And one of the questions, in fact, on the assignment is to figure out if your camera doesn't give you the option to figure out which histogram it is. One of the things you'll be tasked to do is to figure out which of these three types of histograms it might be. And in fact, I'll tell you right now that an easy way to tell with colors is that if you see a whole mess of colors like this, then it's probably a colors histogram. But if it's just this sort of black and white version, it's RGB. Now, one of the things that I want you to notice about this colors histogram is that it really is just sort of this combination of these three individual colors channels. So it's superimposing one on top of the other and actually adding those two. So it's actually adding the colors together and showing you this colors one. So it looks confusing because it's this cyan, and so you have to sort of know that that cyan is this combination of green and blue, and so it gets to be a little bit confusing, I think. So colors, it's pretty useful, I think, only when you have photographs. Then you'll actually see different humps. For example, you see like a red hump here and a blue hump there, for example. Then you'll be able to know where the majority of the colors are that exist in your photograph. And the RGB one is more like an average of those three. So we have the red, the green, and the blue channels, and it's combining them and averaging them in some way. Oops, forgot the blue one. And it's putting them into this black and white version that we're calling this RGB histogram. So what's important to realize is that for this same photo, the same image, we have essentially two completely different histograms. We have a luminance histogram where there's this big gaping hole about 30% of the way in. Then we have an RGB histogram that actually spans the entire width of the histogram itself. So this implies that there's some actual sort of difference, useful difference between these two types of histograms. And indeed there is.